You and I are on a journey together. We're seeking knowledge and inspiration on what it means to live our healthiest, strongest lives, to show up in life as the best version of ourselves. And on this journey, we've met many different people, heard many different voices from all walks of life. But they've all had one thing in common. They've all cared deeply about aging well. Hello and welcome to the Over 50 Health and Wellness Show. My name is Kevin English and I'm your guide on this journey. I'm a certified personal trainer and nutrition coach, and I created this podcast as a platform for voices in the healthy aging community. Join me each week as we explore the wilderness of exercise, nutrition, and lifestyle in our quest to find out exactly what it takes to become the healthiest, strongest versions of ourselves. Before we embark on this week's journey, I want you to take a minute and think back to when you were at the lowest point in your life, your rock bottom. Can you still remember that pain, that anguish? More importantly, can you remember how you got out of that dark place? What steps did you take to get to where you are now? How has your rock bottom shaped the person that you are now? My guest this week is Dean Hall, and on today's journey, we'll follow Dean all the way to his rock bottom and the miracles he's experienced on his way to becoming the man he is today. Hello, my guest today is Dean Hall. Dean is a licensed marriage and family therapist, success coach, author, motivational speaker, and expert in the exciting new field of neuroacoustics. He is also a two-time cancer survivor and record-setting swimmer, having become the first person in history to swim the entire length of the Willamette River in Oregon and the River Shannon in Ireland. Dean, welcome to the show.
Hey, Kevin, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to being here.
I'm really excited to dig in and talk to you about what you're doing these days, maybe even figure out what the heck neuroacoustics are and why that's exciting. But let's back up and start at the beginning. Sure. Tell us, what were you like as a child? Were you an active boy?
Well, if you talk to my mom, she'd say, Kevin, he was much too active. I'm a native of Portland, Oregon. And I was born in 1960, so I got to experience Portland in the 60s and 70s. And I tell everybody, before there were adventure athletes, there were Oregonians. You know, we were all running and trail running and mountain climbing and cross-country skiing and snowshoeing and kayaking before anybody else seemed to hear of it. And so both my mom and dad were mountain climbers. And I was part of that culture from the time I was born. So I was very active. I think I had about as heavenly childhood as a boy like me could have had. When my buddies were watching the Scooby-Doo marathon all weekend, I was climbing Mount Hood. And most of our weekends, we were out 7 to 10 miles backpacking, where back then you wouldn't see anyone the whole weekend. And then all summers long, every chance my parents got, we were somewhere out in the Cascades and not seeing people for weeks at a time. So it was just absolutely phenomenal as far as I was concerned. Yeah.
And what about when you got into school? Were you active in sports?
Oh, yeah. Every sport that they would let me play. My only problem was I couldn't play two sports at a time. I even asked. In my school, you either had to go out for track or baseball. I wanted to do both. I didn't see why I couldn't, but the coaches seemed to differ. So yeah, anything you could get me in, I was in. Until about 6th, 7th grade, it was all about basketball. Even though I was the shortest kid there, I just would play for hours and hours at a time. Anytime we weren't out in the woods, I was playing basketball. But then soccer, I was introduced to soccer, and about 7th, 8th grade, it just took over, mostly because you get out there and you had to be creative and you had to watch a field, and coaches really couldn't tell you what to do. And I guess I was enough of a rebel. I loved it being fluid and no set plays. And the older I got, the more I realized it was kind of like a very physical form of chess. There was a real mental side to it and real strategy. And it's very, if you know much about soccer, it's very geometric. You're always trying to build triangles or collapse triangles. And so you're always watching this thing happen. Plus, this was before the AIDS epidemic, and there were very few games where I didn't end up bleeding. And for me, that was fun. I just loved tearing it up. It probably kept me out of jail, Kevin. So my time with sports as a kid was really fun.
Yeah, it sounds like very formative years there. If you had all that outdoorsy kind of experience and then lots of sports, it's kind of interesting the way you described soccer, certainly as a kind of a physical chess game. And yeah, I certainly can see how that would be very appealing to somebody that enjoys that, like you said, that fluid kind of environment and that more strategic thinking part of a very physical game. But to your point, you knew it was a really good game if you ended up bleeding at the end, right?
Yeah. And like I said, it kept me out of jail because I got really bored with high school very, very quickly. And luckily enough, I was able to be one of the first Junior Timbers Olympic development teams, the first Nike sponsored team, because Nike's up here in Portland. And they took us to the West Midlands in England twice. And so it was my first real experience of traveling outside of the country without my parents. And that was just thrilling, not only to be playing soccer over there, but mostly being introduced to a different culture. And this was in 76 and 77. So I was still pretty young. And it was just, we'd never heard of punk rock over here. And when we were playing in London, we were introduced to all these crazy people that were punks. And we're like, yeah, well, you look like punk. But then we went to a concert and it was just so insane. It kind of got me hooked. So it was just, sports opened up a whole world of travel and culture to me that I hadn't seen anywhere else.
Yeah, what an amazing opportunity to be able to travel over to England and go play soccer over there and broaden your cultural horizons there, get introduced to punk rock and good stuff there.
I'm
That's
not
fantastic.
sure punk was broadening my cultural horizons.
Well, I don't know.
Maybe
there's something might argue
I don't know.
That's right. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. All right. So after high school, what happens? Where do you go?
High school, I had several, not long ago, I saw an old guy like me wearing a T-shirt that said, "The older I get, the better I was." And that's kind of the way I think of my soccer career. I had scholarships all over the West Coast and some in the Midwest and Northeast, but this tiny little church college in Kansas. And I'd gone to a couple church camps and had a great time. So I thought, okay, a tiny little Christian college has got to be like year-long church camp. Plus, I get to play soccer and they're going to pay me to do so. So it sounded like a great idea, but it's probably because I was young and dumb. But I went to this tiny little college in Kansas, not knowing I'd meet this cute little Kansas girl and fall in love and put myself in exile for love. And so after high school, I played for this little college. They said they were good. They really weren't. And so it was kind of disappointing as far as sports go. But I learned a lot. Mostly, I'd seen Europe, and that was interesting and surprising. But culturally, it didn't feel that much different than Portland. But then I got to Kansas, especially small town Kansas, and it felt like I'd been dropped on the moon. It was just so different.
That's your culture shock, right?
Yeah, exactly. But fell in love and got married pretty early. I was almost 21, so I was just a kid. But that's kind of what a lot of us did back then. And she was real sweet and very honest with me. She said, just because you came back to Kansas doesn't mean I'm going to follow you out to Oregon just because we're married. If you're going to marry me, I'm pretty close to my family. You're going to stay here. And so I thought about it for about 8 months. And then I thought, no, okay, I'll do that. And so that's what I did for 30 years. Yeah, 33 actually.
So, and spending all that time in Kansas?
Yeah.
Or most of that time? Yeah.
Right. Okay. And became a teacher, taught for 20 years and really loved it. Just absolutely loved teaching. But as is true with most teachers in the U.S., I was going broke while I was doing this thing that I actually loved. And Kansas had the second lowest salary in the US. And once we had our daughter, I just thought, I'm having a good time, but I don't think it's fair to my family. And so I went back to school and got my degree in marriage and family therapy so that not only could I continue to do what I felt was important in the world and give back and maybe make a difference in some people's lives, but actually not be broke while I'm doing it. So for 13 years, I taught and tried to build a private practice. Do one in the morning and the other at night. And that sounds pretty awful, but it really was kind of fun. They kind of balanced each other out.
So now you're out of school, you're teaching, you're married, you got a young child. Were you still active? What about all that activity that had been so important in your life up until then?
Well, my parents, they were really unique in a lot of ways. Back in the 60s, growing up, no parents were really that into fitness, but mine were. My dad was a marathon runner. My mom always exercised because she wanted to stay in shape to climb mountains and hang with the boys, And so they were a fantastic model of fitness. And they were the only parents I knew that actually were in love. They really liked each other and they really enjoyed spending time with each other. And they did a great job of showing me what a love relationship was. And so when I saw them, one of my only goals in life was to kind of recreate their lifestyle. And so I felt like I did it on the relationship end. And I'd had a bad soccer injury my last year of college, totally hyperextended one knee all the way backwards and tore everything imaginable in it, had several surgeries. And so I really couldn't run that much. I couldn't play soccer anyway. And so I started doing triathlons. And that's really what got me into swimming and loved it. However, in order to be super competitive, at least back then, you had to run sub-6 splits on the mile for, 24 miles. And I could never get sub-6. I was doing good to run 6:15s, but I could never do sub-6s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got to interrupt you there because I'm not sure everybody listening is gonna appreciate what you're saying here. So you're talking about Ironman distance triathlons, is that right?
Right.
Okay, but the writing was on the wall. You apparently you wanted to be pretty competitive because if you don't mind, let's back up first and just tell people what are the distances in an Ironman.
In an Ironman, it's swim, bike, run, and the swim is 3.3 miles, and that's considered a marathon. And so when I'm swimming these rivers now, I still use Ironman marathon distances to tell people how many marathons a day I'm swimming. And then 140 miles on the bike. Depends on the area. It's either 140 or 144. And then a full 26.2 to run. Yeah.
And then what you were referring to there before I cut you off there is that in order to be really competitive there, you needed to be able to run sub-6 minute miles on that marathon. So I just wanted people to put that into perspective. We're going to have a very long swim. We're going to have a ridiculously long bike ride. And then I don't know how many folks out there listening to this know what their mile time is for just 1 mile. But I'd say that if you're over 50 and you're running a sub-6 mile, that's a pretty good. I mean, at that point, you're not jogging, you're running, right? That's a very brisk pace is my point. And it's a torturous pace over 26.2 miles. So and hats off to you. I think you said you were like 6:15-ish or something like that on your splits.
And to be very clear, I quit doing full marathons right around early 30s and started doing what they call sprint triathlons, where you're doing a 10K and a 40-mile bike, and then, or 1 to 2 mile swim, 40-mile bike, and then run a 10K. But it was torturous for me because I'd usually come out of the pool or the lake or wherever we're swimming in the top 10. I'd pass everyone on the bike, and then everyone would pass me on the run. And so that's my triathlon days, but I just absolutely loved it. I loved the mental side of that, just like the soccer is finding that muscle where you're crawling back somewhere inside of your head and making your body continue to go when everything is screaming to stop. Yeah, especially a pace. I never worried about finishing, but keeping a very brisk pace is always very mentally challenging. Yeah.
It certainly is. Yeah. And I think anybody who's done any endurance type exercise can absolutely relate to that. So it sounds like we had a soccer injury, which led you into triathlons. And is that the first time then that you started doing any real swimming? Is that where the swimming comes in?
Well, interestingly enough, I always loved swimming. Really, where I was most introduced to swimming is up in the Alpine Lakes and the Cascades. And it became almost a family joke. We'd backpack, and almost always we'd try to find a nice, pristine Alpine lake to stop and camp at the night. And my dad would look at it, and he's like, bet you can't do that one. Bet you can't. We'd call it swimmable. He's like, that doesn't look swimmable. And swimmable meant swim all the way back, across and back. And this started about when I was 8 or 9. And I'd jump in and I'd swim all the way across and back, and they'd cheer for me and congratulate me and warm me back up. And I thought they were just celebrating that I was a champion, but I was such a talkative ADD little guy that I think they were doing it just for 30 minutes of quiet, because they knew if they had my face in the water, they'd get some peace. So
some peace and quiet. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds early on you had that love of water, and
Right.
that sounds cold. I'm down here in coastal North Carolina, and what I would consider cold, you're probably going to chuckle at, but that sounds like chilly water. Is that fair?
Yeah, usually. And that was part of the thing too. I was such a skinny little bony kid, but I've always been able to handle cold really well. And most of those lakes in the summer, because that's mostly when I do the swims, they're probably right around anywhere from 42 to 49 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're cold. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that I would consider that cold. All right. Well, so we've got you now in Kansas. You've
Right.
been active your entire life. You're married, you have a daughter, you're living this kind of an idyllic life. It sounds like you're being active. You're a teacher by day, and you've got this private practice for, I think you said, family and marriage counseling that you're building up as you go along. And now I think we're going to roll into the 2000s, right? And
Sure.
things are getting ready to take pretty dark turn. Why don't you talk us through that? So I think it was around Christmas time in 2006.
Right. Yeah. Starting 2000, I got additional trainings in trauma, and it was a real exciting time in therapy because they were really coming out with new approaches to psychological trauma. And I started learning some of these and being trained in them and being certified in them. And so very quickly, my business just exploded because using some of these mind-body techniques, people started recovering from trauma. And so much so that when they go back to their doctor, even before they had a chance to say something, the doctor would be like, what's happened to you? And they'd be like, well, I went and worked with this guy. And so a lot of the doctors started referring to me, and I started specializing particularly in sexual trauma, because so much of depression and anxiety, particularly in the American female population, you can track right back to sexual trauma. Many times childhood, but it doesn't matter. And so I was working day in, day out with sexual trauma and not realizing that I was, number one, overworking. Number two, not exercising as much as I usually did because I'd gotten so busy. Number three, really not eating a very clean diet because I was always on the run. But mostly, I believe the biggest thing was I was being secondhand traumatized myself. In order to really help these people, I had to hear their story. And what a lot of people don't realize is when you hear a story, you imagine you're there. And I hadn't even realized that. And so, 8, 10 times a day, I was in the middle of the most awful rape and molestation and incest situations and absorbing that stress myself. And so 4 days before Christmas on 2006, I was going to get a total knee operation. Finally, I'd been waiting for it for years. And they just did the blood test. Well, I'd never really even been sick before. Not really. I'd had the flu and a couple colds, but nothing big. And I took the blood test, and they called, the clinic called the blood test to, make sure I was okay for surgery just a few days before the surgery. And the clinic called and they said, "Hey, Dean, something's wrong with your test. Some things came back wrong." So I came back in, took the test, and then my doctor called that night, and he'd become a really good friend, and he was always stressed out. So at least once a month, he'd show up at my office, and I'd take him through some mind-body kind of guided imagery exercises to help him de-stress. So that's what I thought he was doing. And I said, "Hey, Aaron, what can I do for you?" He's like, "It's not what you can do for me. It's what I got to tell you." And I thought, oh no, he's in trouble. It still didn't occur to me what was going on. And so he got in my office and he was just ashen. And I knew he had something terrible to tell me. And his marriage had been real rocky. And I thought, he's getting divorced, or he's done something he shouldn't. And so I was kind of gearing myself up to be okay with whatever mess he was in. And he's like, "Dean, you got leukemia and it's not good." And my first thought, I don't know if it was shock or what, but my first thought was, "Oh, good, he's okay." And then it was like, "What? Wait." And he says, "Dean, you got leukemia." And he's like, "I've talked to the oncologist." He said, "We've never seen anything like it. You've got features of both acute and chronic. And if we've never seen anything, so we've got some favors. We're calling in, one of the world's top leukemia experts, because we're afraid there's nothing that can be done if you've got both. And if the numbers don't change in the next 6 weeks, you probably got maybe a month or two." I was like, wow. And my first thought was for my daughter. She was 14 at the time. And I don't know if you've been around 14-year-old girls, but I'm of the belief that they need their daddies. And so I thought, man, I gotta do whatever I can to hang around. And so thankfully, in a couple weeks, the blood work changed and the way the blood was acting changed, and it calmed down to just be chronic. And my father actually had chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And so for me, even though I was very, very sick, I kind of breathed a sigh of relief, because I knew I'd watched his journey, and I knew that if he made it at his age, I probably could too. Even though there's not supposed to be any kind of genetic or hereditary link for leukemia between father and son. So yeah, it just literally dropped the bottom out of my life.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say I can imagine. I mean, I can't, but it sounds like up to that point, you'd been healthy your entire life. You've been active your entire life. And maybe there towards the end, to your point, maybe some of that activity had tailed off, and it sounds like maybe your nutrition wasn't really on point. And that's very interesting that you kind of led the story about your practice really growing in the trauma field, especially with these victims of sexual abuse. And I can picture how listening to those horror stories day after day can really take their toll from internalizing that as stress for yourself. And then for you to get this, a bad blood test and it not even come close to occurring to you that's a red flag. And then again, when your doctor friend comes over, you're thinking, "Oh no, what's wrong with my friend?" And it turns out that's not at all what the case is. So where do you go from there? So you've got this diagnosis now, you're sick. What happens next?
Really sick. I just struggled. But what happened then, Kevin, is within weeks, I'm having to use the same muscle I developed in triathlons to keep myself going, just to get from the bed the 10 steps to the bathroom. And then I get on the toilet and I'd be like, I don't know how I'm going to make it to the bedroom. And so I'd sit there for a while and just try to gather strength and make my body move and get back to the bedroom. And then I'd sleep the whole rest of the day. It was just horrifying. I felt betrayed by my body. And it had always been the one thing that I'd counted on. And so I didn't know kind of where to put my faith anymore. I didn't, most of my self-confidence came from, I'm so stubborn, I'm just going to do it. And I didn't have the strength of that stubbornness anymore. I just didn't have any strength whatsoever. So it was pretty bleak. Days that I would get up and make it to the office. By this time, my practice had boomed and was going so well that I'd quit teaching. And so I could, make my own schedule. And, it was a little town, so everybody knew I was sick. But the nice thing about people who are having problems is if their problems are big enough, they don't care if you're sick or not, they'll come in. And so days I'd get up and I'd work 2 or 3 hours and go home and sleep for the next 2 days. And that's I don't remember much about 2007. That was kind of 2007 right there. Yeah.
And okay, so we've got you, you're really sick. Obviously, we know how this story ends. It's to some degree, because we're sitting here talking today, but you're not done yet. Where do you go from there?
Well, the way I got better, I didn't do any chemo or radiation. Thankfully, when I was a kid, they didn't have ADD or I'd have been heavily medicated. And so I'd never really slept my entire life. But I really started even as I started feeling better and not needing just constant sleep, I would, instead of stay up till 1 and get up at 4, I would go to bed at 10 and sleep till 6 or 7, really try to get 8 or 9 hours of sleep in. I really just became a fanatic about trying to even drink a gallon of water a day, good water. And this is when the Atkins diet was really big, and I didn't do many of their products, but I really started concentrating on protein, getting very careful, especially with sugar, because I heard that sugar just feeds cancer cells. So I eliminated almost all, especially synthetic sugars, from my diet. And even though I loved fruit, I kind of limited that intake as well. And then the other thing I did is I'd started a practice of meditation October of 2000. And I started meditating 2 and 3 times a day and not holding on to anybody's stuff, especially my own. And I found that being a male raised in the 60s, I did a lot of stuffing, especially if I was scared of something, worried about something. I'm never going to let anybody know, but the body knew. And then if I ever got angry, because I was raised in a very faith-based home, anger was the devil, So I tried my best never to let that out either. And so I constantly would ask myself, how much anger or fear am I holding in my body? And meditating and finding ways of releasing those so that I'm not carrying that from one day to the next. And my numbers started to really improve. And about this time, February, March of 2008, I'm doing pretty well again. All the numbers are really healthy again. I'm not really feeling tired or the drag. That friend, the doctor, Aaron, he called leukemia mono on crack, because that's kind of how it feels. You're just super tired and no energy. And I wasn't constantly feeling draggy. And so I thought, okay, I got this lick. Hopefully I learned the lesson. I'm going to do a lot better self-care from now on. And I thought, wow, dodge that bullet. Let's go forward.
And so at that point, 2008, 2009-ish, or wherever we are in our story here, are you declared in remission? Are you
Well,
now officially
and
a
that's the
cancer
thing.
survivor?
Yeah. With chronic lymphocytic leukemia, all the books tell you that once you get it, you can never get rid of it, that the best you can do is manage it, and it'll probably cut down your life expectancy. But you need to constantly, the closest you can get to remission is just keep your numbers really low of white blood cell counts. And I never believed that. And the doctors used to get so frustrated with me because they'd be like, hey, you're going to have this forever. And I'm like, no. I said, if my body created it, my body can heal it. And they just kind of pat me on the head like I was a stupid, uneducated person. But no, they don't believe that you can ever go into remission with CLL. But if there was a remission, it felt like I was in it at that time till really July of 2010 is when my life took the next huge nosedive. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, we're not done with the story yet, right? It gets worse.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm looking at your timeline. You've got this all on your website and your blog. It looked like you got really, really bad food poisoning, kidney failure. You're in ICU for over a week. And then I think it's shortly after that things are going to get much worse, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I just was busy and being kind of stupid and not thinking. My wife, who had always been super healthy, she was so Baptist that she'd never had even a taste of beer. If you can imagine that, never had any alcohol, never taken any drugs, refused most prescription drugs, even though she'd take them if she had to, never smoked a cigarette, not even one puff, always worked out. That's what made me fall in love with her. She was as much into a fit, healthy lifestyle as I was. And she got sick, and there had been pneumonia going around. And in rural farming America, that's not unusual in the summer because there's so much dust and wheat and pesticides in the air that people often get some kind of respiratory disorder or pneumonia. And so she got it, and she just never kept getting better. And so I was trying to take care of everything and left a sandwich that I'd picked up at a convenience store because I was in a hurry in a plastic carton in 108-degree heat. And I'm a guy, so I was hungry. I saw it. I'm like, this looks like a good idea. And so I just nibbled on it real quickly and not thinking about what had happened to the mayonnaise in there in 100-degree heat. And yeah, talk about stupid. But I got really severe food poisoning and really didn't know what it was because it wasn't acting like food poisoning. It was so much worse than any food poisoning I ever had. My temperature is going way sky high to like 103, and I just projectile vomit. And then it would drop, and I would sweat through the blankets and have severe chills. And so I'd never really even taken Advil much in my life. And so to manage the temperature, I found a bottle of Advil, and it said take 2 every 4 hours. So that's what I did. The bottle didn't say don't take longer than a day or two. I took it 6 days, and because I was so dehydrated, and so I called my folks out in Portland, Oregon. I'm like, I don't know what's going on. And they're friends with the nurse, and she's like, he better get to the emergency room right away. So I went to the emergency room, and the intern started acting really weird. He was running around and acting all alarmed, and I'm just sitting there, and I know I'm sick, but come on, have a little professionalism, don't go crazy. And so I called up my buddy Aaron, who was chief of staff at this hospital, and I'm like, Aaron, I'm going home, man. Just tell him that this is stupid. And he's like, Dean, they just called me. You're in total renal failure. He's like, don't go home. The reason he's running around is you could die. I thought, oh, I am sick. So I was there and they shuttled me up to Wichita, Kansas a couple days later because I kept getting worse. And they couldn't find out what had happened until this brilliant doctor from Croatia. He was so brilliant that I was almost happy to be in the hospital just to get to meet this guy. And so he asked me all these questions and did all these tests. And finally, he's like, Dean, I have one last question. I'm like, what's that? He's like, did you take Advil? And I'm like, yeah, every day, every 4 hours. And he was like, that's it. He said, if you hadn't taken anything, you'd have been fine. And he said, it's a good thing you didn't take Tylenol. That would have ruined your liver. He's like, your kidneys will come back. But during this time, my wife's right side fell and she lost feeling in her right arm and a little bit in her right leg. And by the time I got out of the hospital, she couldn't drive herself the 60 miles to Wichita. And she was having a hard time speaking. And so I called up Aaron. I'm like, hey, have you seen Mary? And he's like, I've heard. He's like, I'm going to get you in to do a brain scan tomorrow. So we did. And as soon as the brain scan was done, Aaron called up and he's like, hey, when are you going to be home? And I said, you're going to make me wait an hour to hear bad news? And he's like, well, and I said, I know you wouldn't have asked that if it wasn't really bad news. And he's like, well, it is, Dean. It's the biggest brain tumor I've ever heard of. And it's nestled way down in the back on her brainstem with a lot of fingers. He's like, I'm going to pull some favors and get you up to the world's number 3 in Kansas City in 2 days. And so we went up there in 2 days. By this time, Mary's having a hard time even speaking and I can't hardly walk. And I knew something was desperately wrong. He looked at the film and he's like, we could do laser guided surgery and there's an 80% chance we'd nick a nerve and she'd be a quadriplegic, and another 80% chance we could nick a blood vessel, even with laser guided surgery, and she'd bleed out on the table. And I said, if you had total success, what would the prognosis be? And he said, it'd give her an extra 6 months and it'd be like she had a migraine and the flu the whole time. I was like, what if we don't do anything? He said, well, she'd get worse and she's got about 6 months and she'll just lose more and more of her capacity to talk or to walk or to reason. And she'll sleep more and more and more. And then she'll die in her sleep and it won't be particularly painful. And so I said, I guess that's what we do. And that's what we decided to do. And only 52 days later, she was dead. 15 days for our 30th anniversary. So, yeah.
All right. So you've had all these challenges up to now. But
Yeah.
there are things that you could face down. And
Right.
to your point, you kind of had this stubborn part of you that said, hey, I can outlast things. You outlasted your leukemia. You survived trying to poison yourself with Advil and with bad mayonnaise. But now you're in this really dark place. Talk to us a little bit, because I know that we still have another chapter to go on the leukemia here.
Right.
But during that time after Mary's death, I mean, where are you at this point in your headspace? What's going through your mind in the months or maybe even year after that, in terms of trying to make sense of your life at that point?
I just absolutely couldn't. I just, before I started specializing in sexual trauma, I specialized in grief. And so I knew a lot about grief, had written several articles for newspapers and magazines around the Midwest. I had done several retreats and seminars on grief. I knew a lot about grief, I thought, until I was the one grieving. And for me, it felt especially painful because I felt like I had given everything to this relationship. Living in Kansas, I tried to grow where I was at, but there wasn't a day, and I rarely, if ever, told her, but I was lonely for Oregon and homesick every day. And all I wanted to really be doing is hiking and backpacking and swimming and mountain climbing. And I don't know if you've been to southern Kansas, but it's pretty hard to do any of those things. And so I felt like for 30 years, I'd sacrificed and done my part. And this is what I get. And I know that's a real victim kind of way of thinking, but I just couldn't shake it, Kevin. And, knowing what happens in grief and then going through grief, I just made all of the mistakes that you're not supposed to make. I was real angry. I let myself be very isolated. I tried to not think about it and kind of ignore it. I knew so much about it. I thought knowing about it was going to give me a pass on the pain, which just made the pain more incredible. It was just, and living in this tiny little town, being from the West Coast, even though I'd taught there and lived there for 30 years, people still didn't call me by name. I was Mary's husband. They'd point to me and they'd be like, hey, there's Mary's husband. Now, some of my students, they'd say, hey, there's Mr. Hall, but everybody else in town, there's Mary's husband, because Mary was from there. And when Mary was alive, that was fine with me. I didn't care. Yeah, I'm happy to be Mary's husband. It really hurt when they still would call me that, and I wasn't anymore. And the town was so tiny, there wasn't a brick or a tree or a curb or anything that didn't remind me of her, that I didn't have a memory with her on. It was just like being in this sensory overwhelmed tank where I just couldn't get away from it. Yeah. Complete misery.
Complete misery. And I suppose to your point, most of our listeners being over 50, we're going to know something about grief. But to your point, knowing intellectually about grief, being maybe a grief counselor or even being an expert on grief is not the same thing as going through grief. And I think we can all relate to that. Okay. So, and this is 2010, is that right?
And I just turned 50.
2010.
And was really,
turned 50.
We were really looking forward to this decade because we'd worked so hard, been so responsible. We were going to have fun. Yeah. So it felt like
getting ready to celebrate your 50th and 30-year anniversary. Your daughter's 16?
18. It was October of her senior year, which made it extremely painful too. Yeah, we wanted it to be a real celebratory year because she's such a good kid. And it just, I was a walking zombie. Her mom was gone. It was, I don't know how she still maintained a 3.5. I don't know how. I sure as heck wasn't maintaining a 3.5 in my life. I don't know how she did.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're going to roll into 2011. Tell us what happens.
I moved back to Oregon.
We're ready for some good news, right?
Yeah. Well, there isn't for a couple more years. I decided, even though my practice was booming and I'd worked on it for 20 years and it made no sense to leave it, I just couldn't stay. And I would always be Mary's husband. And I knew at some point maybe life would come back and maybe I'd want to have another relationship. I knew in that town that wouldn't be okay. And I wasn't even thinking that far ahead. I was just thinking, I got to get away. Things are miserable. And Kansas, without the cute little Kansas girl, is Kansas. So I saw my chance to come back to Oregon, thinking I'd build another practice and kind of start up where I left off and have a great time being around my family and getting to do the things I love to do. But it took me 18 months because of bureaucratic red tape to get my license in Oregon. And it was just one thing after another, one frustration after another with the state of Oregon to get my license to practice. It actually was a godsend because I was in mental or emotional shape to practice. I needed a sabbatical for sure. Yeah. And problem is, I just kept getting sicker. And by 2011, the leukemia came back, and this time brought with it lymphoma, non-Hodgkin small cell lymphoma. And I started losing weight and getting really emaciated. I was biking and still staying pretty active, but I was getting sicker and sicker all the time, mostly because of the grief, I think. And my lymph nodes, especially around my jawline, swelled up so much I had a hard time turning my head. And I looked kind of disfigured and kind of like this weird chipmunk. And I got down, I'm 6'1.5", and right now I'm 220. And I got down to 158 pounds. I looked like I'd stepped out of Auschwitz by 2013. Yeah. And my parents were terrified that I was dying. Yeah. And I really didn't care.
I suppose that at this point we can say you're officially, is this rock bottom? I mean,
yeah.
At some point, we're going to have to stop with these tragic stories here. We've been talking for the last 20 minutes, and it's just gone from bad to worse progressively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In August of 2013, I'm living in this little duplex, renting for the first time since I was in my 20s. And that felt weird. And all alone. And when I left Kansas and gave up my practice, I didn't realize I was incurring another huge loss. You know, for us men, so many times our identity's wrapped up in our career. And so my real identity was being a husband, Mary's husband. That was gone. And now being a therapist was gone too. And then all of my adult friends and all of the kids I taught that knew me and loved me and I loved them, that was all gone. Nobody knew me. Nobody cared. I am truly all alone. And so August of 2013, I get up and I made a practice of not trying to look at myself because I've never thought I was good looking, Kevin. But at this point, I was ugly with a capital UG. It was not a pretty sight. And I accidentally caught my eyes in the mirror. And that guy didn't even recognize him. He had red-rimmed eyes with big bags under him. He was so skinny, I could see every rib and even my pelvic bones. And he just looked so sad. And I'd never seen that sad. I'd never looked at myself when I felt sad. And it just broke my heart. I just like, who is that guy? And the thought occurred to me, you know, if I let this take me, it'll be a sad story, but nobody will know. Nobody will blame me. I can let this, I've had a good run. I've accomplished everything I wanted to in life. I'm done. And just the very next thought was, by this time, my daughter's 21. I'm like, what an entirely selfish thought. You know, she just lost her mom. Are you gonna go out like that? And so I thought, no, I gotta bring it back. And I knew I'd worked with people bringing themselves back from trauma, from depression, from anxiety, even many suicidal folks. And if I could get them passionate about a purpose, and it really didn't matter what purpose, anything, it had the power to bring them back. And so I started asking myself, what could I become passionate about? And all the things I'd been passionate about before, I just couldn't get too excited about. I mean, it made sense to try to build a practice, but I didn't really want to. And I'd written a book, and I could write another one, but I really didn't care. And so I didn't know. And so I'd been living there 6 months by this time. And I looked around, and I hadn't unpacked it all. And I thought, well, you know what? Until life answers and I get a real good idea of what I can be passionate about, maybe I should just clean this place up and unpack my boxes. So the second or third box I opened, I came across a journal I was forced to keep in 6th grade. And at the very front of the journal, as soon as I opened it, it said, because there weren't bucket lists in those days, but I had my own bucket list. It says, when I get old, I gotta climb Mount Everest, swim the English Channel. And I don't know what about that, Kevin, but my whole body just lit up. And it was like, okay, I've had some friends that have climbed Everest. And with my leukemia and my blood counts, I don't think my blood can handle altitude, and I'm pretty sure my immune system can't handle Kathmandu. But I'm pretty sure I can swim the English Channel. And I got really excited about it. And then I was going to bed that night and I thought, are you crazy? You got leukemia and lymphoma, man. You can't do that. But then I thought, yeah, I can. And then the very next day, I searched to see if any active cancer patient had ever swum the English Channel. And to my knowledge, there hadn't been. So I thought, okay, I'm going to be the very first person to get a chance to do that. And one of my majors in college was world history. And I thought, I'll be the first person in history to swim the English Channel as an active cancer patient. And that just got me super excited. And so that's what I decided to do.
So you decided to swim the English Channel because you had written it. It was sixth grade, I think you said.
When I was
in a
11.
journal that you were forced to keep.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. So, but where we left off in this story, you were at rock bottom. You weren't and didn't sound like you were in any physical condition to swim the English Channel.
No.
How did you get into shape to eventually go on and do the things these amazing physical feats that you're going to do? How did you climb out of rock bottom?
Well, I told my parents, and I mean, you're talking about the original adventurers, and it made my mom cry. She's like, that's going to kill you. Are you crazy? And my dad's like, well, you can't do that. Well, I think the fact that he told me I couldn't do it, it's like, okay, I'll show you. Then I called my buddy, Aaron, who, man, I didn't realize until today how much he was a part of this story. And he's like, Dean, you get in a public pool and it'll kill you. Your immune system's so bad. And I'm like, what am I going to do? Die watching Wheel of Fortune? I'm not going to go out like that. And so I gambled. It didn't really feel like a gamble because I was already kind of a little done already. You know, I felt like this could kill me, but if I'm going to die, I want to go out swinging for the fence, not with a whimper. And so I got in the pool and I kicked off the wall, and it was the first time in 3 years I felt like myself. It's like, oh, my whole body just kind of came awake. It was like, I remember you. I remember this. And it was just blissful for about half a lap. And I was in such bad shape. I promised myself to swim 10 laps. Well, 10 laps, that doesn't even take 10 minutes. And it doesn't really even get you breathing hard. It took me over an hour. And one of the things my dad would always do when I was a kid is he'd make me run, or we'd be climbing up a hill and he'd be like, you tired? And I'd be like, yeah. And he's like, okay, do one more. And he would always teach me to go to the edge, do as much as I possibly could, and then find a way to do a little bit more. So I made it to my 10th lap, and then I did an 11th. And I went home, and for the first time, I felt happy. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like myself at least a little bit. And for the first time in 3 years, I slept that night. Yeah, so I just kept going every day and swimming and trying to add one more lap every day. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're putting that progressive overload, the theory of progressive overload to use there, swim one more lap every day.
Yeah.
And eventually you're just going to find yourself, right? You're going to start getting stronger. And so we read out in the introduction, we know that you swam the entirety of the Willamette River, which is, I think, is 184 miles. Mm-hmm. You also swam the River Shannon in Ireland.
Right.
So tell us, so you had this goal. You're like, hey, I'm going to be the first guy with leukemia, active cancer patient, to swim the English Channel. Now you're actually in a pool and you're swimming even against doctor's orders, but you're starting to find yourself again. How do we get from there, from just swimming an extra lap each day to actually swimming 184 miles?
Yeah. Well, by Christmas, I was swimming a mile or two a time, and I built some muscle again. And I don't know if you know about the lymph system, but it doesn't work unless you're moving. There's nothing to pump it. The only thing that pumps it, and the lymph system is such that your lymph nodes are tiny little kind of filter sacs that the blood runs through. And as the blood pumps through there, it squeezes and expands those and kind of flushes those out. And so every day that I was getting cardio, it was flushing those out. And at first, it kind of gave me like flu-like symptoms because they were so toxic. But after a while, they got a little smaller. The ones around my neck and then under my right arm had what my oncologist lovingly called my hockey puck. It was the size and shape of an actual hockey puck. I couldn't really put down my right arm. Those were stubborn and those didn't change much. But all the other hundreds of other ones that were like gravel all over my body started to go down. And I started feeling really good and my head started to clear. And one day, right around Christmas, I got out of the pool and it hit me. Who cares if another middle-aged man puts on a Speedo and swims to France? It does the world no good. And in my case, it's not going to be a pretty picture. And so I started asking myself, what would be even bigger? What would do the world some good? And it hit me, the longest river in Oregon is the Willamette River. And I was born only 4 blocks from it. And growing up, I always called it Mama River. And I thought, okay, 21 miles across the English Channel or 184 in a river that nobody swum. Not only will I be the first, I will be the only. And it was more me because I was born here. And so it just felt right. And so I contacted the local Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and they were really excited to partner with me to raise money and awareness about leukemia and lymphoma. And so it just felt like a match made in heaven. So that's what I did. I got in the river June 3rd, 2014, and swam for 22 days in 40-degree water and came out into the Columbia and became the first person ever to swim the entire length. Yeah.
And as an active leukemia and lymphoma, yeah, fantastic. So at this time, because it sounded like you had really lost your identity. You had said, my identity was wrapped up in being Mary's husband. It was being a therapist. It was certainly being active and an athlete, right? And all of that had been stripped away. Now you've got this purpose. You've got this crazy idea. Hey, maybe I could swim the English Channel. And then, what would be even more meaningful to me? And so you've got this accomplishment under your belt. Where is your headspace now?
Really, I would say 75% better. I felt really good. And it's something that first occurred to me. I was out here for a triathlon in 1984. And I said to my dad, I was feeling full of myself because I'd done pretty well in this triathlon. I said, hey, anybody ever swam this whole thing? He's like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. He's like, where do you come up with that? He's like, that's just stupid. And it sunk a hook in me. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do that someday. But I'd forgotten about it. And it had come back to me. And so it felt like I'd gotten a dream back. And one of the things I didn't tell you is I had 6 guide boaters, because when you swim a river, you can see about 10 yards and about a half a mile. But especially if the river is going fast at all, danger is usually 20 or 30 yards ahead. And in Oregon, we've got so many big trees and they fall that the first 60 miles was really pretty scary because there were a lot of log jams and huge Douglas firs in the water that if I got pushed up against them, there would have been 2,000 pounds of pressure that had never gotten me off of them. Or with their limbs underwater, they're what's called strainers. If I'd have gone under, I'd have been caught in that. And so you've got to have a guide boater that you follow. And about a month before the swim, one by one, my guide boaters bailed. And so my dad, who was 79 at the time, he's like, hey, why don't I guide boat? And I said, what? I said, Dad, you're 79. I can do it. Okay. Dad, you've never kayaked. Oh, I've done a lot of rafting. I've done a lot of canoeing. Kayak can't be that hard. And so it was one of the blessings. And I tell everybody, when you follow your dreams, miracles happen. The gifts are given to you that you just wouldn't ever imagine or make up. One of the coolest things was just doing this adventure with my dad for 22 days. It was something we'll always remember. Yeah.
Yeah, I bet it would be. Yeah, that is amazing. I didn't realize that your dad joined you on that.
Yeah.
And then you're a couple of years later. Well, hang on, because I think there's also a part in your bio here. You had some more good news in March of 2016. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I had a lot of good news. I knew I was feeling really good, and when I did the Willamette, I'd never heard of cold water immersion and never heard of Wim Hof. But after I gave quite a few talks to different public groups afterwards, and always had a question and answer time, and people would always raise their hand. Hey, have you heard of Wim Hof? No. And so I thought I better. And then a lot of people would also ask me, have you heard of Wallace J. Nichols and the Blue Mind? No. And so I looked at both these people, and they both use science to explain why I was feeling so much better. Wim Hof's done a lot of research that if you're in even a slight state of hypothermia, it boosts your immune system, it gets your metabolism going. It really does all sorts of wonderful things for the body. And then Wallace J. Nichols is a marine biologist down in Southern California, and he did a lot of work with neuropsychologists proving that it doesn't matter who you are, gender, age, race, culture, a universal instinctive reflex in the human brain is that if you're in, on, around, by, under water, within about a minute or two, your brain goes down to a relaxed state. And so, unbeknownst to me, this crazy dream I had was really the largest part of what healed me. The first blood test I took, the leukemia was gone. And by this time, I was going down to the world's number 3 oncologist, University of California, San Diego. His name's Dr. Castro, world's expert. And he was like, Dean, I've done this for 30 years. I've written papers on this. I've never seen this happen. But if I hadn't been the one to really confirm your diagnosis, I would have thought you were misdiagnosed. And so by swimming and being hypothermic 8 to 10 hours a day for 22 days, it burned out the leukemia, evidently. Yeah.
Wow, that is amazing. What an incredible story, just from where we started the story to where you are now.
Yeah.
You're now going to be declared cancer-free. And I think I read, I can't remember, it might have been one of your Instagram posts, but you described yourself as cancer patient, cancer survivor, cancer thriver, to cancer adventurer. And so I think at this stage, we're in your cancer adventurer stage.
Right.
And then you're going to go on a year later and you're going to swim another big river, this time the River Shannon in Ireland. Is that right?
That's right. My daughter was still really grieving and really hurting. And I had noticed what being on the river for that amount of time did for me. And the Leukemia Lymphoma Society said, Dean, this was so cool. You need to take your message worldwide. Why don't you do another swim, but why don't you make it outside of the U.S.? Well, in Portland, so many of us had parents or grandparents from Ireland. We've got a heavy contingent of Western European, at least in the 60s and 70s we did, Western European and UK folks who came and settled here because the scenery and the weather is so much like you'd find in the UK. And so I think they naturally just settled here. And so all my growing up years, Ireland sounded like the land of dreams. I always wanted to go to Ireland. And right after I finished the Willamette, I turned on PBS, and there was this PBS special on the River Shannon. And it looked so cool. And it looked a lot like the Willamette. So I started looking into it. I found out that it was Ireland's longest river. It's about 180 miles long. And so I thought it's about the same as the Willamette. Actually, it's 220, but the last 40 are called a sea estuary, so it's really not counted as part of the river. But I thought, okay, here we go. And so I was going to do that in 2016, but this beautiful yoga instructor, personal trainer came into my life, and my family and friends were pretty awestruck by her kindness and her strength and her beauty, and really kind of wondered why she was interested in me. And I wasn't dumb enough to ask that question. I was just going to enjoy it for as long as I could. And we just fell madly in love, which was surprising to me. I'd had a good run and a good marriage, and I thought, when you have that kind of marriage, you're not going to have another one. And even though Bobby is very different than Mary, she's just wonderful. And I'm just so lucky to have her. And so we fell madly in love. And so instead of going and swimming, I just chased her all of 2016. And we got married December 10th of 2016 then. And I'm glad we did, because then she went with us to Ireland too. And my daughter was the guide boater. And by now, Bree is 24. And I don't know what I was thinking, Kevin, to take a 24-year-old girl, take her to a foreign land, a place she'd never been, put her in a kayak, and say, okay, you're pretty much responsible to lead me 180 miles. But I did, and she did, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. It made the Willamette look like a cakewalk. We had 20-mile-an-hour headwinds at least, 23 out of the 25 days it took me to swim it. And it's pretty much a set of lakes tied together. Two of them are so large they're considered inland seas. We got blown off of them several times. And the riverbed is shale and flint. And when they break, they create razor sharp edges. And so if I ever try to crawl onto the riverbank, it was just slicing me up. I bled in the River Shannon. I tell everybody I'm part Irish now because I got so much of my blood in the River Shannon and River Shannon in me. So, yeah, but we just had an amazing time, and we raised quite a bit of money for their local cancer charity, the Childhood Cancer Foundation of Ireland, which made it just really wonderful.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's beautiful that you had that experience first with your father and then with your daughter on these really amazing, life-changing events. And so what are you doing today? I see you on Instagram. Looks like you're still doing a lot of kind of that cold water immersion, kind of Wim Hof type stuff. What's keeping you busy today?
Well, I was going to swim my longest swim last summer. And then COVID hit, and my sponsors, because it was going to take me 90 to 120 days. I won't tell you which river. Yeah, I'll go ahead. I'll just tell you the river. I was going to swim the Columbia. It's a 1,243 miles long. A guy says he swam it in 2003. He was mid to late 20s, I think, but he didn't document it. And that's kind of like saying, you beat Michael Jordan, but you didn't keep score. And so I want to become the first documented person to swim the entire length of the Columbia River. And it seemed like perfect timing because this year I turned 60. And one of my missions is to tell people, not by my words, but by my actions, that you can get older, but you don't have to grow old. You can just, through staying fit and keeping a good outlook in life, optimize and stay as young as you possibly can for as long as you can. And I believe so much of that is mental. I believe after 50, most people quit dreaming and pushing themselves and challenging themselves to do more. They just decide to retire, and it seems like they retire their dreams at that point too. And I think that's a mistake. At least I've found in my return to health, I'm almost I am fitter than I was in my 40s and 50s, and almost more fit than I was in my 30s. And I hope I'm a lot wiser, and I'm sure a lot happier. And so we don't have to lose those things just because we're losing hair and eyesight and hearing ability and that kind of stuff that just happens with age. So I was hoping to do that. All my sponsors pulled out in the first week after COVID. And it didn't even seem like it would be appropriate. None of us knew how it was going to go. And so I'm still waiting to do that. This summer, I hope I'm working with a film crew that wants to create a documentary about my life. And we're going to do a trial run over in the UK with one of the longest rivers over there, hopefully, if I can travel. And then next January, we're hoping to go to New Zealand and swim the 3 longest rivers there in a row. Yeah.
So you're not letting up. This is what you do now. Yeah,
Yeah.
you swim long rivers. That's amazing. And I guess all of these, you mentioned sponsors and whatnot, and all of these, I'm sure there's a charity tied to them as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, usually I try to, and I haven't planned any charities out yet. I'm thinking about starting my own nonprofit to make it easier for folks. But one of the things I like to do, particularly if I'm not in the US, is I like to find a nonprofit like a Childhood Cancer Foundation or something, because it feels really inappropriate to go to this beautiful country, have this wonderful time, make all sorts of lifelong friends, and then take the money out of the country with me. And so I like to leave the money there and do it for the place. And so usually I decide a couple months before. And so if people will follow me and want to, be a part of this, all they have to do is track me on Instagram, and they'll be able to find the right places to give if they choose to.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. And I'll make sure I drop both your website and your Instagram into the show notes. It's swimmingandmiracles, I believe,
Right.
.com. And that's your Instagram handle as well. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Dean, as we're kind of wrapping up here, sure, I can't let you go without asking you, what the heck is neuroacoustics? If I'm even saying it. Sounds like some kind of sound therapy, maybe.
Yeah,
but
it is. That's exactly what it is. It's the scientific study of the therapeutic use of sound. And so they found certain vibrational tones and hertz have different vibrational frequencies that affect your brain in therapeutic ways. And then also out of the field of hypnotherapy, they've found certain musical cadences or verbal cadences really calm and soothe the mind. And so when you put all those together, particularly with stereo headphones, using certain tones in the right ear and then in the left ear and get them going back and forth, it can create a very healing state for mind and body. So that's what it is. Yeah. And I've played around a lot with that and had a lot of fun, but my swimming's kind of taken over everything now.
The swimming's all consuming. Yeah.
It kind of is.
I can see. Yeah. All right. Well, I guess right before we go then, talk to us a little bit about your coaching practices today. So what kind of services do you offer?
Right. One of my favorite services that I offer is with my wife, Bobby. She takes the body side. I take the mental, emotional side. And I use a lot of my clinical techniques, but what we both use more than anything is we combine those with our life experiences. We call it comeback coaching. By the time you're past or into your 50s, most of us have had something devastating happen, be it a divorce or a loss of some sort, or now with COVID, job changes, who knows what. And it feels, especially after your 50s, it feels devastating, like you can't go on. And one of the things I'm absolutely convinced of, Kevin, because I've seen it hundreds of times now, is I'm nothing special. I'm nothing special. The beauty of it is if you do what I did, you'll get what I got, and probably better. And Bobby came from a 30-year marriage as well, but sadly for her, it was constantly a negative experience, and she just held on and held on and held on and held on so long she felt like she could never build the life that she really wanted, especially a relationship. And so she finally decided to leave the relationship, and she, a year or so before that, really started working out and got in shape, and in her mid-50s decided to become a fitness model. and did really well in some of those competitions. And she thought, how could I be in better shape and be doing well in these competitions in my mid-50s and feeling better than ever? And then once we met, we couldn't believe that at our age, number one, we could fall in love and be, acting like little kids and enjoying life this much at our age. And so if you do what we do, you'll get what we got. Of course, I use my 31 years of practice to kind of boost that too. So that's one of my favorites. But a lot of my coaching is right now with men. I've got a lot of men in my coaching practice and I just love that because, again, it's pretty easy to relate to them. And most of them, it's just learning the secrets of moving forward and overcoming the challenges and the losses in life.
Yeah, I'd say you're eminently qualified for that type of life coaching, certainly for overcoming loss and between your personal life experience and then your professional background. Well, Dean, I want to thank you again so much for coming on and sharing, just opening up and sharing your story. You're an amazing inspiration. You're a fantastic ambassador for healthy aging. I love what you're doing, and I wish you all the best in all your future endeavors.
Kevin, it's been a privilege and an honor, and I'd really like to thank you for being the spokesperson for all of us who are over 50 and wanting to show other friends and family members you don't have to give up just because you're aging. It can be a wonderful experience. So thank you for being the spokesperson that's promoting that out in the world.
Well, that's our show for today, folks. If you enjoyed today's episode, please tell your friends and please consider subscribing and giving us a 5-star review. All the show notes and much more are available at our website at silver-edge.com. That's silver-edge.com. So until next time, stay strong.